begin with, I'd like to pass out to all of you a very brief selected book list that includes some of the items that I have around here on the blackboard and a number of others that I haven't brought with me. It's quite selective. There's as many more and then some as I have written here. But I thought this might give you an overview of what is available, what can be obtained from bookstores by asking them to order for you, what can be obtained from Armenian bookstores and Armenian newspaper offices which sometimes carry some of these books, what can be found in some of the university libraries around. Some of these are even offered in the public library if you request them. So I'm going to let you pass these out, and if you ever decide that one of these items is suitable for use in one of your classrooms or would be helpful as resource material for you, feel free to contact the Armenian Assembly office, which has recently opened on Wilshire Boulevard. The resource director there could help you locate a number of these, and if he doesn't have them available immediately, he can probably let you know where to find them. I'd like to begin by suggesting that Armenian literature is not a thing of any specific period. It's not a thing of the ancient past. It's not a thing only of the 20th century. Armenian literature has been around as long as the literature of ancient Greece, for instance. It begins in very much the same way as the literature of ancient Greece does, with mythology, with legends of the gods and goddesses, and a little bit later on with epic poetry, follows through with religious literature when Christianity becomes the religion of the nation, proceeds with history, goes on with poetry, and in the 1700s, 1800s, begins to develop in terms of the type of literature that was prominent in Western Europe, because the Armenian writers had contact with the literature of Western Europe. We begin to get the novel. We begin to get the short story. We begin to get the ideas of revolution, of ethnic independence that were apparent in many of the regions of Western Europe, until the great tragedy of 1915 cut off a great many of the writers and brought about a different kind of literature, a literature of the diaspora, of the Armenian who was not living on his homeland, the Armenian who either spoke of great longing for the land that he no longer possessed, or spoke of the difficulties of being a stranger in a strange land, or perhaps even living in the small portion of historic Armenia that became the Soviet Republic of Armenia, speaking in terms of his own yearnings for his own homeland there. I'm going to try and give just the briefest of overviews because anyone well-versed in Armenian literature knows that you cannot do this in an hour or so. It would take a year-long college course to even scratch the surface. Consequently, let me just begin with the surface, and perhaps you'll get a picture that could be useful to you at some point. I'd like to begin with the mythology. The Armenian gods and goddesses are somewhat parallel to those of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and Persia. One cannot say that they're exactly parallel, because each society, each civilization puts its own stamp on the ideas that others have lent it, and the borrowing becomes adaptation. Consequently, since Armenians were part of the ancient world and a very prominent part, their gods and goddesses reflect those of the nations with which they had contact. And so we begin with the chief of the gods, the one who corresponds to Zeus in the Roman mythology, and Jupiter and Zeus in the Greek and Jupiter in the Roman mythology, Aramas. Aramas, the king of the gods, was the architect of the universe. His temple was located near the medieval city of Ani, about which I may refer a little bit later on. The festival of Aramast was celebrated in August. It was the New Year for the ancient Armenians. His wife, Santaramed, was invisible. This was a property which her counterpart in Greek and Roman mythology did not possess. Hera, the consort of Zeus, was not quite what we know of as Santar-Ahmed in Armenian mythology. She was the giver of rain. Later on, she became associated with evil, with the underworld, but not in the very beginning. One deity that's uniquely Armenian, I don't know of a parallel in Greek and Roman mythology, is Dir, or Kuro. He is the keeper of the records of men. It is he who tells Aramast of the good deeds, the heroic deeds of individuals, to see if they were fit to enter into the Armenian mythological salvation. He was also the supervisor of the oracles, the interpretation of dreams, which somewhat gives him a bit of the Apollo aspect, but you'll see that Apollo fits elsewhere. The goddess who represents sort of the golden mother, the mother of chastity, the benefactress of mankind and of course womankind, is Anahid. Anahid more or less corresponds to Artemis in the Greek and Diana in the Roman mythology. She also has a temple, hers at Erzincan, where there was a gold statue erected in her honor. Her festival occurred in the summer of the year. The dove, the rose, things that symbolized peace and loveliness seem to be associated with her. The Armenians had a goddess that was somewhat comparable to the Greek Aphrodite. Called Astri. Greek Aphrodite is the Roman Venus. There's the idea of love, of passion, of beauty. Her temple is at the city of Van. There's some connections with the Diana idea in that she's also connected with the moon in some of the ancient myths. Her husband corresponds to the husband of the Greek Aphrodite. Her husband is Vahakan. The god of war, the god of power, again comparable to the Greek Ares. He is supposed to have cleared Armenia of dragons and fought many heroic battles. Then we come to Nune. Nune, the goddess of the household, the one who's in charge of thrifty management, the one who more or less represents the Greek Hestia and perhaps a little of Hera also. That would be the Roman Demeter and Juno. And finally, Mir, the son of Aramast, corresponding to the Greek Hephaestus, the Roman Vulcan. He guided heroes, rewarded the victors. His festival was in the springtime, and his perpetual flame burned always in his temple. Now, along with the mythology of ancient Armenia came legends about the founding of the nation. The technical, historical, factual origin of the Armenian people seems to be way back in around the 11th, 10th centuries BC, when a group of people from Macedonia crossed into Asia Minor and merged with the Urartuans who lived on the soil of central Anatolia. And then, as time went on over the period of centuries, the mixing of these two produced the the Armenian nation. But that's not the way Armenian legend tells it. Armenian legend tells of the story of Haig and Pell and takes the Armenian background back to the time of Noah. When you go back that far, Haig is supposedly a descendant of Japheth, one of the three sons of Noah. And I want to read you a brief version of the Haig and Pell legend. This is quite summarized, but it will give you the idea and the basic story background. Once upon a time, not too long after the time of the flood, two giants lived. One was named Haig, and the other Pell. Pell was the dictator of Babylon. He was a very cruel and tyrannical ruler. Haig, on the other hand, was a good, kind man who lived under the jurisdiction of Pell. After enduring Pell's opposition for many years, Haig looked for a way out. He gathered up the members of his family, some 200 people, and set out toward the north. Finally, after much travel, they reached the plain of Ararat and decided to settle there. When Pell discovered that Haig and his family had left Babylon, he became very angry. He sent a soldier to try to persuade Haig to come back, telling him that he was leaving a beautiful climate and a comfortable home. Haig responded that he would not return because he valued his freedom more than the comforts of Babylon. The soldier carried Haig's message to Pell. The dictator sent back the threat that if Haig did not return, an army would be sent to compel him to do so. Again, Haig refused, reasserting his desire to be free. When the soldier returned with Haig's message, Pell had no choice but to gather up his army and set out toward Mount Ararat to force Haig to return. Pell's army arrived at the base of Mount Ararat, and the battle began. Haig and his family fought well and bravely against the forces of Pell. The war ended when Haig shot an arrow which not only went through Pell's armor, but also through his body, landing on the ground behind him. When Pell's soldiers saw the remarkable feat of strength on the part of Haig, and the death of their own leader, they turned back and returned to Babylon. Haig and his family were free. They made their home in the territory around Mount Ararat. Thus began the Armenian nation, Hayastan, the land of Haig, founded by the Hai's, the people of Haig. This is the Armenian legend of the beginning of their nation. Now, the Armenian literature that I've mentioned so far was primarily an oral literature because the Armenians did not have a written language at this time. There was literature written down. As a matter of fact, one of Armenia's kings, Artavast, was a writer, wrote plays, but wrote them in Greek because the language in which the Armenians wrote was either Greek or Aramaic or some of the other languages around, simply because Armenian didn't have an alphabet, didn't have a written language. But as we move forward in time, we come to the year 405, and all of a sudden, things break loose in Armenia. A monk by the name of Mesrov Mashtov, and I'll write this name on the board because it's one of the major names in the history of the Armenian nation, whether you're talking about literature or history or anything else. Was sent to devise a language with which the Armenian people could express themselves on paper. Now, one thing I must mention before we go any further is that Armenia had become a Christian nation in 301 AD, about 6, 7, 8 years before the Roman Empire became Christian. The Armenians, very proud of being the first Christian nation, wanted to express their religious thoughts in their own language, wanted to be able to use the Bible in their own language and not have to rely on the languages of other people. Consequently, Mesrov Mashtovs, a monk, was sent to work out an alphabet for the Armenians. There's a legend also about how the alphabet came to him in a vision. But fact tells us that Mesrov had traveled to Egypt, he'd traveled to Greece, he'd studied at Alexandria, he had experienced the language systems of a number of countries, and when he returned, devised a 36-letter alphabet, which has since become 38, and Armenia became a written language. Immediately, translations of the most important works of literature began. First and foremost, the Bible. Scholars who've been deep into biblical history and have read the Bible in a number of languages agree that this is one of the great translations of the Bible. That's sometimes called the Queen of Translations. Not only was the Bible translated, but many works of the ancient world were translated. Greek histories, dramas, number of works which in later times, because of war or disaster or whatever, were lost. And the only means of preservation they had was through their Armenian translations, which is in a way a paying back of the cultural debt that Armenia did owe to some of these Western countries. As we proceed a little bit further on in time, Armenians began to write history about themselves. One of the great early historians was a man by the name of Movses Khorenatsi, Moses of Khoren. He wrote the history of the Armenians in 3 books. The first book dealing with their ancient history, starting with Noah, Adam and Eve first, then Noah, then the Hagen Pell story, and the founding of the Armenian nation, and then a story that I'm going to read to you in just a moment. The second book deals with the Armenians' difficulties with the Parthians. The Parthians were a group of people from Persia with whom the Armenians had a good deal of conflict in the early centuries AD. I proceeded with Armenian history up until the end of the 3rd century AD. The third book takes the 3rd century and the first quarter of the 4th century. And to let you taste a little bit of Movses Khorenatsi, I want to read you the story of Ara and Semiramis. For a few years before the death of Ninus, Ara reigned over Armenia under his protectorate and found the same favor in his eyes as his father Aram had done. But that wanton and lustful woman, Semiramis, having heard speak for many years of the beauty of Ara, wished to possess him. Only she ventured not to do anything openly. But after the death or escape to Crete of Ninus, as it hath been affirmed unto me, she discovered her passion freely, and sent messengers to Ara the Beautiful with gifts and offerings, with many prayers and promises of riches, begging him to come to her to Nineveh, and either wed her and reign over all that Ninus had possessed, or fulfill her desires and return in peace to Armenia with many gifts. And when the messengers had been and returned many times, and Ara had not consented, Semiramis became very wroth. She arose and took all the multitude of her hosts and hastened to the land of Armenia against Ara. But as she had beforehand declared, it was not so much to kill him and persecute him that she went, as to subdue him and bring him by force to fulfill the desires of her passion. For having been consumed with desire by which she had heard of him, on seeing him, she became as one beside herself. she arrived in this turmoil at the plains of Ara, called after him Ararat, and when the battle was about to take place, she commanded her generals to devise some means of saving the life of Ara. But in the fighting, the army of Ara was beaten, and Ara died, being slain by the warriors of Semiramis. After the battle, the queen went out to the battlefield to search for the body of her beloved amongst those who had died. And they found the body of Ara amongst the brave ones that had fallen, and she commanded them to place it in an upper chamber in her castle. But when the hosts of Armenia arose once more against Queen Semiramis to avenge the death of Ara, she said, "I have commanded the gods to lick his wounds, and he shall live again." At the same time, she thought to bring Ara back to life by witchcraft and charms, for she was maddened by the intensity of her desires. But when the body began to decay, she commanded them to cast it into a deep pit and to cover it. And having dressed up one of her men in secret, she sent forth the fame of him thus: "The gods have licked Ara and have brought him back to life again, thus fulfilling our prayers and our pleasure. Therefore from this time forth shall they be the more gifted and worshipped by us, for that they are the givers of joy and the fulfillers of desire." She also erected a new statue in honor of Ara, in honor of the gods, and worshipped them with many sacrifices, showing unto all as if the gods had brought Ara back to life. And having caused the report to be spent all over the land of Armenia, and satisfied the people, she put an end to the fighting, and she took the son of Ara, whom his beloved wife Nuvart had borne unto him, and who was but 12 years old at the time of his father's death. And she called his name Ara, in memory of her love of Ara the beautiful, and appointed him ruler over the land of Armenia, trusting him in all things. Now, obviously this is not factual history, but it is history the way they told it in times when legend was more real than factual history was. Now, at the time that I'm speaking about, the time of the translation of the Bible into Armenian, the time of the use of the Armenian language to express Armenian ideas, the time of the histories of Moses of Choren, there were a number of other historians, that century, the centuries immediately afterwards, in an age that was called the Golden Age of Armenian literature. And I'll just toss out a few of the names and give you a general idea of the sort of things they wrote about. Names such as Agathangelos, Faustus of Byzantium, Lazarus of Tharp, people who wrote about the kings of Armenia from the time just before Christ, the time of Caesar and Mark Antony, through the times that they were living in, dealing with some of the great battles that the Armenians had. And I think maybe I ought to mention that one of the events that was constantly recorded in Armenian literature was the Battle of Vartanants. I understand you've had a lecture on Armenian history already. You've probably heard of Vartanants, am I right? This was the battle between the Armenians and the Persians over whether or not the Armenians would give up their Christian faith and adopt Zoroastrianism. The Armenians lost the battle, but the Persians did not inflict Zoroastrianism upon them, and so they believe they actually won the victory even though the war was lost. This is a constant theme in Armenian literature, not only at the time of the event itself, but afterwards. There's one individual whom I wish to mention, even though he's not exactly a literary figure, simply because I find him fascinating. This is a scientist. Anania of Chirac lived in the 7th century. Some of the ideas that he came up with are not found in Western science for well, 800 years. He came up with mathematical tables, a comparative study of the weights and measures of a number of nations of his time, the Greeks, the Jews, the Syrians, the Persians, and the Armenians. The idea that the earth is round. You hadn't heard the idea that the earth is round from very many people at this time. He believed that when it was day on one side of the earth, it had to be night on the other side. And that had not been mentioned in the ancient world. He looked at the sky and saw the Milky Way and didn't think it was the hair of some goddess or something else like that, but believed that this was star clusters that we simply couldn't see because they were too far away. He believed that the dark spots on the moon were depressions. He believed that the origin of matter was the beginning of its destruction. The idea that matter is not recreated, it simply disintegrates and forms some other form of matter. All ideas that would be very prominent in the new science as it developed in the Western world, but the Western world was living in the Dark Ages then, and Anania of Shirag and others of the Near East were the ones whose science was the most advanced. Well, as we progress onward, we move into the Silver Age of Armenian literature. This age begins at the time of the Fakraduni dynasty. This is the period around the 900s in the eastern part of Armenia. The part that is just on the very far eastern border of present-day Turkey, where the city of Ani is today, just some 300 yards or so from the border. It's very difficult for an Armenian in Soviet Armenia or a Western Armenian who travels there to stand in Armenia and look across the border at two of Armenia's most prized historical possessions, Mount Ararat and the city of Ani. But nevertheless, in the Silver Age, we had great poets, almost mystical poets, dealing with religious subjects for the most part. And I would like to read very briefly a few of the poems from one of the poems from one of these individuals. The one I want to read is Krikor Narekatsi, Gregory of Narek. It's called The Christ Child. The lips of the Christ Child are like to twin leaves. They let roses fall when he smiles tenderly. The tears of the Christ Child are pearls when he grieves. The eyes of the Christ Child are deep as the sea. Like pomegranate grains are the dimples he hath, and clustering lilies spring up in his path. Just a very short poem, a lovely poem, tender. Armenian literature seems to be able to span war, invasion, turmoil, upheaval. The Armenians have moved many times, even within their own homeland. With the arrival of the Turkish forces in the 11th century, the Armenians and the Greeks were forced to move from the areas which they'd occupied for millennia. The Greeks defeated in Constantinople, the Armenians defeated at Manzikert in the area around Ani, both of them having to evacuate long-held territories. The Armenians moved a little bit southward into the area that is called Cilicia. This is the, if you can picture where Turkey hits the Mediterranean, the bottom coast of Turkey, this is the far eastern edge, just as it's moving, it's curving around into the Middle East. Many Armenians went there, some of them across into the area that is today the Soviet Republic of Armenia. In this new kingdom of Cilicia, Armenian writers flourished again. And one of the most famous of them is a monk called Saint Nerses the Gracious, or Nerses Shinor Ali. He wrote a great deal on theology, treatises, pamphlets, this sort of thing, a number of historical poems, many hymns and prayers, but he didn't limit his writing just to these items. He also wrote for the ordinary people, things that they would be interested in, riddles for the common man, acrostic poems. I'd like to give you a sample of both his religious writing and then some of his riddles. This is just a very brief, small hymn. O morning of light, O righteous sun, illumine me. Issue from Father into my soul that which pleases thee. Of treasure of charity, of thine hidden treasure, make me the inventor. One of his prayers. In faith I confess and bow down to thee, O Father and Son and Holy Ghost, uncreated and immortal nature, creator of angels, of men, and all things. Have mercy upon thy creatures and upon me, great sinner that I am. In faith I confess and bow down to thee, O light indivisible, consubstantial Holy Trinity and one Godhead, creator of light and dispeller of darkness. Lift from my soul the darkness of sin and ignorance, and illuminate my mind at this hour, so that I may pray to thee according to thy pleasure, and receive from thee the answer to my prayers. Have mercy upon thy creatures, and upon me, great sinner that I am. And now a riddle or two. This for the common people. There was a strong, fiery child. He drank dry the river's water. He got sore at the horse and the ass. He harvested the grain from the field. And the reader, the listener, is supposed to guess who is represented. This one is Autumn. There was an inn in the land on the side of a busy road. The strangers used to come in, and those well-known used to go out. The world. I saw a child born in the morn, who died the same day. Born again after burial, he appeared more beautiful. The sun. No discussion of Armenian literature would be complete without some mention of Armenia's contribution to the epic, the great piece of poetic literature which most peoples on this earth have managed to create. The Armenian epic is David of Sassoon, and I brought with me today two copies, two versions. This one, a poetic translation. David of Sassoon is done in 4 parts. This poetic translation, called David of Sassoon, includes all 4 parts and is done in verse. This one, called The Daredevils of Sassoon, is done in prose and condenses the story somewhat. Both are available. This one is published by Ohio University Press, this one by Alan Swallow, and there are many places around that you can purchase them. As you know, epics seem to tell the story of a nation at the time of crisis. A national hero emerges, embodies the virtues of the society, and contends against the threat to that society, which of course represents the powers of evil. In this case, the setting is the Arab invasions of the Armenian territories in the 7th century. And the heroes are several, the most important of them being David. The governor of Egypt, a person by the name of Misra Melik, has dominions over the region around Sassoon and has the right to collect tribute taxes, but hasn't done so for quite a while. All of a sudden he decides it's time to do so. He better catch up with what he has been missing. And so he sends his army into the area of Sassoon to collect a number of things. 40 tall maidens, 40 short maidens, 40 thin maidens, 40 fat maidens, 40 of a number of items to be topped off with 40 bags of gold. Well, the Armenians in Sassoon struggle against the forces of Misr al-Malik and have considerable difficulty. But at this time there's a small child in the village who seems to be giving everybody an awful lot of trouble. His name is David, and he wreaks havoc, it seems, everywhere he goes. He's so strong that when he touches something it crumbles. He steps on things and bad things happen. At any rate, his uncle Orhan decides he's got to take care of this child so that the village won't be totally against him. Decides to make the child a shepherd. He gets him a pair of iron shoes. He sends David up into the mountains to tend the sheep. Well, David's iron shoes wear down very quickly. He romps around the mountains so much that in one day they're worn down to nothing. He also has a strange talent. He's able to make friends of the wild animals with no difficulty at all. And as he comes back to the village, he not only has the sheep, but he has the lions and the wolves and everything else with him. He doesn't know the difference because they're all tame as far as he's concerned. You can imagine the reaction of the people of the village when David brings home their animals in the evening. At any rate, he's sent back up into the mountains and comes to the hut of an old crone who grows turnips. And David eats some of these turnips, and the old crone tells him to harm the oppressors of his people, not to harm her or the things that belong to her. So David comes back to the village, complete with the wisdom that the old crone has given him. Take care of the oppressors of your people. Don't let your uncle give his gold away, and things like this. David's army comes, Misr al-Malik comes with it, and the army of the Egyptians, the Mamelukes, devastates the area around Sassoon. And David finally realizes that the only way to solve the problem is for him and Misr al-Malik to engage in single combat. This usually happens in most epics. The hero engages a representative of the opposing forces in combat, and between them they settle the fate of the nation. Well, each one is allowed 3 blows. Misr al-Malik gets the first 3. And as he swings the first time, David is pushed backwards as far as the border of the Armenian territories. He comes back again the next day. As Misr al-Malik swings the second time, David is pushed backwards as far as Baghdad. And he comes back again. As Misr al-Malik swings the third time, David is pushed back as far as Egypt. And when all the smoke is cleared and things have settled down, David comes back again, and now it's his turn. He gets 3 blows. And as he's about to swing the first one, Misr al-Malik's mother says, "Please, for me, don't kill my son. Don't strike this blow." And David, who respects mothers, bows to her wishes and doesn't strike the first blow. He's now ready to strike the second blow. And this time, Misr al-Malik's sister says, "Please, for me, do not strike this second blow." And out of respect for sisters, David refrains from striking the second blow. He has 1 left. And he says, "This one is mine." Well, Misr al-Malik gets ready. He has himself buried in a deep hole, covered with 40 millstones, covered with 40 ox hides. He thinks he's safe. David strikes his 3rd blow, deep down into the hole. And then we hear a voice. Mr. Melik's voice. They take off the 40 oxhides and the 40 millstones. Mr. Melik is down in the hole. He looks intact. But when he is taken out, this intact body falls apart because the sword of David has split him in half. The invasion is repelled. The forces of Egypt no longer threaten the Armenians. And David goes up in the mountains to rebuild the monastery of his father, which had been destroyed in these struggles. And there's the story. Well, there's another book after the David of Sassoon story. There's 2 books before it, but this one is the most famous. Now I keep my eye on the time. As we deal with Armenian literature, we find that there are a great many small fables, little tales that people like to tell their children and old folks like to spin. These are not literary works written by any individual. These are, again, folk literature, stories that one sends on from generation to generation. And I'd like to read, well, see which one. I'd like to read one to you that's called The Ball of Gold. At one time, a rich couple and a poor couple lived next door to each other. The poor people, who had a small child, laughed and had great happiness every day. The rich people had much money, but were never happy. No sounds of laughter were heard in their house. One day the rich woman said to her neighbor, "You are poor, you are hungry. Why is it that you are so happy all the time? Every night laughter fills your house and spills outside. It even touches us next door." The poor woman merely said, "We have a ball of gold. I toss it to my husband, and he tosses it to me. This is what brings us so much happiness." "A golden ball?" the rich neighbor asked. "Yes." So the rich woman went home and told her husband that their neighbors tossed each other a ball of gold each evening. This was the cause of their happiness. "If that's all, that's nothing," the husband said. "I'll have a beautiful golden ball made. Then we'll toss it to each other, and we'll be happy just like our neighbors." So the man had a beautiful golden ball made. But when the husband tried to throw it to his wife, it was too heavy to lift. When the wife tried to catch it, it bruised her fingers. Instead of happiness that night, they shed tears of pain. The next morning, the rich woman visited her neighbor again. "Tell me, what kind of golden ball is it that you have? My husband had a golden ball made for us, but it is too heavy to throw, and it crushes our hands as we catch it. What kind of a ball is it that doesn't hurt you, but brings happiness instead?" "Our golden ball is this beautiful child," the poor woman said. "We toss him to each other, and this joy brings great happiness to us. He is the ball of gold which fills our home with laughter and with love." So you see, the rich try to find happiness in their wealth, but frequently it is without joy. Real happiness is found in family and children, and in this way, the poor can be richer than the rich. This story, well, to give you the source of it, comes from a series of folk tales and legends told by Susie Hugasian Villa, published in Detroit, and the book that it comes from is this one. Is that still available? I suspect it is. I purchased it a number of years ago. It's put out by the Wayne State University Press. So I suspect by contacting them it's available. It's just filled with folk tales, legends, and a lot of anecdotal material. Another form of folk literature, common to most countries, is that of the minstrel, the troubadour, the bard who travels from place to place creating songs and stories to entertain his listeners, but also carrying the news. And from Armenian literature, there are two very famous bards or troubadours, minstrels. And I don't know whether we really have time for me to read you both of them. The most famous of them is Sayat Nova, a minstrel of the 1700s, the 18th century, and Jivan, a minstrel of the 19th century, the 1800s. The one I will read to you is the one by Jivan, simply because it reminds me of the poem by Shelley, Ozymandias. Those of you who are familiar with that one, see if you can find the similar thoughts. It's called Unhappy Days. The mournful and unhappy days, like winter, violets and balsams come and go. Let not the strong then boast themselves, nor let the weak be sad, for divers persons of all kinds pass on, they come and go. Fearless and unafraid, the sun sends forth his beaming light. The dark clouds toward the house of prayer float past, they come and go. Earth to her well-taught son belongs with motherly caress, but the unlettered races, like nomads, come and go. Jivan, a guest room is the world. The nations are the guests. Such is the laws of nature. They pass, they come and go. Do you notice he includes his name in the last couple of lines of the poem? This is common to the Armenian minstrel. If you read the songs of Sayat Nova, the love songs, somewhere along the way before he gets to the conclusion of each one, the name Sayat Nova appears. Well, so much for Armenian literature in its earlier times, for the legends, the folk tales, the history, the poets of the Middle Ages. Let's move into the modern world. You'll notice that from the time of the fall of the Kingdom of Cilicia, from the time of the Middle Ages, up until the 19th century, really, Armenian literature is relatively dormant. The basic reason is that Armenia is a subject people at this time. It's no longer independent. It's now being dominated by the Ottoman Turks, who have taken over the lands that were Armenian for 2 millennia and have made it theirs and have kept the Armenians as a servile population. Servile populations don't create much literature. They're too busy trying to survive. And it's not until we get to the 19th century, the early 1800s, that we begin to get winds from the West stimulating the Armenian people to awake, rise out of this subjugated mentality, and express their own native ethnic identity and strive for autonomy. The first, I'm going to erase the board and leave some room for some of the modern names. Sarah, tell me how much time there is.
You have about 50 minutes.
50? 50? Up until the early part of the 19th century, Armenian literature was basically written in classical Armenian, which is comparable to classical Greek. It's a literary language, at this time not spoken by the people, or not very much at any rate. It's the language of the church. It's the language of the intelligentsia in their writings. It's called Kurapar. It's still used in the Armenian church today. It's not a dead language. But if you want to compare it to something that you might be familiar with, if you take Middle English, the English of Chaucer, and compare it to today's English, you have a similar kind of relationship. A language that comes from the Middle Ages, which has not evolved terribly much after that, which is preserved as the language of learning. The ordinary people weren't able to read it, didn't understand it. And consequently, modern Armenian literature begins at the point that writers began to use the vernacular. It was Kachatur Abovian in the early 1800s who first began writing literature in the vernacular, in the spoken language of the people. His great work, Verk Hayastani, or The Wounds of Armenia, published in 1841, was a novel. It's a novel set during the Persian domination of Armenia. Its hero, Aghassi, is a proto-revolutionary type, the kind who's looking for freedom from oppression for his people. The Persians had attacked his village and a girl he was in love with, and he ends up fighting guerrilla style against these people, looking for, on the part of the writer, for a new Armenian who will stand up and fight for his rights, who will resist when he is mistreated, who will answer back if he's being attacked. Another poet, another writer of this period is the poet Mkhitar Beşiktaşlian, and I'll write that name on the board. Beşiktaşlian was a Catholic monk, or a writer who had a Catholic education. He had gone to Venice, and I will talk in a minute about Venice, to the island of San Lazar, where the Armenian Catholics had set up a monastery and a center of learning, and had been trained not only in Armenian literature and history, but had also contacted writers of the West, writers of France of the 19th century, was especially influenced by Victor Hugo. His poems spoke of his love for his homeland, and I can remember where I put that one. I'd like to read it to you. There we go. It's called Spring. How cool and sweet, O breeze of morn, thou stirrest in the air, caressing soft the dewy flowers, the young girl's clustering hair. But not my country's breeze thou art. Blow past, thou canst not touch my heart. How sweetly and how soulfully thou singest from the grove, O bird, while men admire thy voice in tender hours of love. But not my country's bird thou art. Sing elsewhere, deaf to thee, my heart. With what a gentle murmur, O brook, thy current flows, reflecting in its mirror clear the maiden and the rose. But not my native stream thou art. Flow past, thou canst not charm my heart. Though over ruins linger Armenia's bird and breeze, and though Armenia's turbid stream creeps mid the cypress trees, they voice the sighs, and from my heart, my country, they shall not depart. The poems of a person who is far away from his native land and doesn't really have the opportunity to touch its real meaning any longer. I want to go into a little bit into what Venice meant to the Armenians. It was in Venice that an Armenian monk by the name of Mkhitar started a center of learning which involved literature, history, and later spread to Vienna, where another group of monks of the same order began a monastery, which science was emphasized. These are still existing today. If you ever go to Vienna or Venice, you can visit the Armenian monasteries. The one in Vienna has a marvelous collection of ancient coins, beautiful pottery done by the Armenians in the Middle Ages, which is extremely rare and considered some of the finest in the world. Marvelous collection of printed documents, newspapers, perhaps the most complete collection of Armenian periodicals anywhere. The monastery in Venice contains a treasure of manuscripts, illuminated manuscripts, and a whole lot of literary works. It was to Venice that Lord Byron came when he was exiled from England, after traveling through other areas first. And filled with all kinds of traumatic thoughts, he felt he needed some sort of escape. And he wanted the greatest challenge he dreamed was available to him during one of these summers that he spent in Venice. He found it in going to the Armenian monastery, taking his boat, rowing the short distance into the lagoon, and studying with the Armenian monks. He studied Armenian. He helped them write an Armenian grammar in English, and his letters show that he negotiated with his publisher to try and find Armenian type in England with which to set the works that the monks in Saint-Lazare were writing. Whether they ever found the type, I don't know. The letters don't show that. But they do show that Byron knew there was Armenian type in England. He also made a number of comments about these Armenian monks, who he felt exhibited the finest attributes of clergymen that he'd ever seen, who were dedicated to their work, very charitable, not seeking to increase their own stature or their own wealth, but totally involved in what they were doing. A number of Armenian writers went to Venice and studied at the monastery and contributed a great deal to the literature and the knowledge that came out of it. Perhaps Armenia's most famous novelist is a man named Rafi.
And that's where the name comes from. And they're always asking me,
Rafi?
Rafi's down, but we have so many.
Yeah. Rafi is not Rafi's real name. He's Hagop Melik Hagopian. But he used the name Rafi as his pen name, as so many Armenian writers have done. He was encouraged by the editor of a newspaper at Tiflis to write, and wrote a number of novels. His heroes fight dictatorship of any kind. His characters come from every segment of the population, because he believed that in order to attain independence, autonomy, self-determination, whatever, you needed all segments of the population involved. You couldn't just depend on the